Good evening. Welcome to the Mars Hill House of Intellectual Discourse. I'm Joshua Johnson, and we're continuing in the dialogues of Hylas and Philonous by George Berkeley. We just went through a really interesting section between Hylas and Philonous. They were getting really heated with one another because Hylas kind of was retracting on some of the stuff that they had previously accepted and started coming up with any kind of objection he could think of to try to just throw at Philonous. And there was going to be 4 different arguments they had, and we're going to cover this in a review and get ready to finish the first dialogue. And we'll have this dialogue will be done. It's the first of the 3 dialogues, and it's also the most foundational in laying the groundwork for what discussions they're going to be having about God and creation and different things like that in the next dialogues. So this is going to be a very interesting study, wrapping up the first of the 3 dialogues. And hopefully we'll take a small intercession between the first and second dialogue to go over some works from Jonathan Edwards and then start tying things together into his thought. So to go over some review here, last week we saw that Hylas came up with 3 objections right off the bat to Philonous' idealism that he's presenting. First was the active versus passive. And this came with, and he used the difference between the object and sensation. What Hylas was getting at was saying that, he goes, okay, we have sensations in the mind. But they come into the mind when we actively sense redness on something. So red is on the petal of the flower, and I'm actively sensing, as an action, that redness. And when I'm sensing something, when I'm doing that act, that is when the color comes from the object into my mind. It's like I'm grabbing hold of it in a sense. That's figurative, just what Hylas is saying that we do when we sense something. But the response that he got from Philonous was, well, we have to really distinguish between what is an active action and a passive one. And like the example he used was, okay, do you have control over closing your eyes? You can open and close your eyes. That's active. But can you help what comes into your eyes? Are you active in that sensing process? Or when you open your eyes, you can't help what's coming in. Like, can you control that you see a yellow hue coming from a lamplight? Are you passive? Are you receiving that? Or are you actively laying hold of that? And in that argument, he's showing that we are active in certain things. We could even be active when you pick up a flower to get its scent. You're active in picking up the flower, plucking it. You're active in inhaling it, trying to inhale that odor up through your nostrils. Those are actions, but you are passive in actually sensing what the smell is. You have no action or control over the actual odor of the flower. And so what Hylas was trying to get at was saying that we're active in sensing, but that's not true. We may be active in picking up a flower, but we're passive in what the feel is. We're passive in the odor of the flower. If we were to eat a flower for whatever reason, we would be passive in what the taste would be. We are passive in those things. And so he's trying to show him that when it comes to active and passive things, you can't refer to sensations as active. Sensations in themselves are passive. Different acts of the will or of our volition, those are what we would designate as active. So that's one of the first things that was dealt with in that section of the dialogues. Likewise, an objection that was brought up was by Hylas, and this is probably one of the more absurd ones, was, okay, well, we've analyzed all these different sensations together individually. Smell, we've all shown that they're in the mind, but when they combine together, they make up a mind-independent object. Individually, they're in the mind, but together, they're independent of the mind. And this objection was absurd because if each part is shown to be of a particular nature, then the parts together are of a particular nature. And that's because the whole thing has been shown to be in the mind. Goes back to, in fact, Philonous was so upset with Hylas, he goes, either you have a bad memory or you're basically being absurd. He goes, let's go back over this. If you were to take an object, like a snowball, whiteness is in the mind, you say color's in the mind, remove that quality. Roundness is in the mind, remove that quality. Remove coldness, wetness, whatever, what do you have left of the snowball? Nothing. So that whole argument is just totally off in left field. The third one was that, okay, the object and all their sensations are in the mind, okay? But what's causing them into my mind is there's something underlying them, like a substance or substratum, which is poorly defined. Now, what this substratum is something that Hylas was really having trouble with, and Philonous started asking questions. Well, is this substance that underlies all these objects that are in the mind, is it extended? Does it? I mean, you're saying that it underlies. It's almost like it's spread out underneath all these objects that exist in the mind. It must have extension in some sense. But Hylas was like, well, yes, no. He couldn't really define it. Does it have solidity? Because those qualities were shown to be in the mind. If this is mind independent, and it's supposed to be upholding or supporting those things that are in the mind, does it have those things which are also in the mind? If it does the case, that's sort of begging the question. And Hylas couldn't explain what he meant by it. It was so ambiguous, so vague, that it was an undefinable, unknowable thing. He was basically saying there must be something there, but it has no qualities, no properties, it's undefinable, but I'm just going to say it's there. And it was this that was critiqued very strongly by Philonous, and so Hylas just objected it. Dropped it, I mean. And so the fourth thing that got brought up was, and Hylas is still trying to backpedal here, and he goes, and Philonous reacts to him and says, okay, I'm willing to rest it all on this. Can you conceive of an object that's unseen? And Hylas, thinks, oh, this is easy. Of course. I can conceive of a tree that's unseen, that no one sees. But didn't you just see it in your mind when you were thinking about it? Can you conceive of an unconceivable thing? That's not the case, because if you're conceiving of it, then someone's conceiving it, you are. Can you see is it an unseen object seen by anybody? No, because it's unseen. Similarly, an unconceived object is conceived by no one, including yourself. If you're thinking about it, then it is conceived. You just thought about it. And so this is what was called the master argument. The master argument is that all things, and I was essentially trying to say that all things are in the mind, because anything else is completely unknowable, by definition unknowable. So you can't see an unseen object, because once you see it, it's seen, nor can you conceive of an unconceivable object, because then it would then be conceived. That's the argument. And what we have to keep in mind here, that the idea of things being seen has already been established as being in the mind. He's already established that part. So if you see it and you can conceive it, it exists. If it's unconceived or unseen, it's unknowable. That's the point. Because once you've seen it, it's in the mind. Can you prove that there's something outside of that? And the master argument says no. But there were some criticisms of the master argument that were very good. Can we see God? Can we conceive of him? Can we conceive of him in the way that the master argument is asking, in a perceptual way? No. Okay, this was a critique David Hume brought up against Berkeley. David Hume was a great critic of Christianity and theism in general. Another objection was, what about your own mind? Do you conceive of your own mind as like an object or something that you see? Or can you see it? So does the master argument refute the two things that Berkeley was really trying to establish? The mind, the soul, and the existence of God? Now, there's a couple problems. Now, there's problems with Hume's objection. First of all, the problem with Hume's objection is that it's basically attacking Berkeley, and Berkeley never responded, and it's attacking something that Berkeley, I think, assumes in the master argument. Well, one, you can't deny your own consciousness and absurdity. Just like you can't prove it. You can't prove your own consciousness because you'd have to assume that you're unconscious to prove that you're conscious. It's the same thing why you can't prove the laws of logic, because to prove the laws of logic, you would have to reject them, and that would be impossible. You can't prove anything without the use of those inferences. So it's a properly basic. Or even further, it's almost axiomatic, and so you can't reject that anyway. So the master argument is assuming something that you basically can't not assume. And likewise, I think Berkeley, if he would respond, would be like, whoa. I presented this argument in the book already establishing everything else I was talking about. It's not in a vacuum that I developed this argument. So those are some of Berkeley's objections. But as it stands in the book, if we were to separate it, like Hume did, isolate it, it is critiquable. You critique it and say, look, Berkeley was a little bit cocky. He said, I'm willing to rest everything on this. And in doing so, he jeopardizes his own system because he says, okay, this is the argument. Now, if the argument's qualified the way I think Berkeley would qualify it, and he would add the two little different things that he argues also in the book in regards to how his system demands the existence of a God, demands the necessity of the mind, then the master argument's fine. But he didn't qualify it. He left it kind of naked and bare, and so it was subject to criticism. I don't think it hurts Berkeley's system at all that the master argument falls these critiques. The only reason the master argument falls is because Berkeley didn't give enough detail, and Berkeley was being cocky through Philonous. But those were some of the things that we covered in the last study. They were very interesting. We had some really interesting conversation. And tonight we're going to be finishing the first dialogue, and we're going to be going from pages 85 to 91 of the book. I don't have the page numbers for the PDF online for those who are following on YouTube or on Facebook, but I'll be able to post those in due time. So we will continue in the book. All right, we're back. We just finished reading in the dialogues. We just finished the first dialogue officially. The church bell has rung. The discussion in the garden, which really in the book was one morning, but it took us like 7 studies. But it's now concluded. And in this study we see what I would call Hylas' last stand. He's really reaching for something now and trying to just attack Philonous on this, saying, okay, what about this, what about this, what about this? And Philonous is just not relenting, and he's really just going after him and just finishing the conversation. He's driving Hylas to concede, I guess at this point, skepticism. But in doing so, he goes over a series of arguments, and I want to discuss them. Some of these you might be able to figure out what it's talking about in the book. Some of them aren't, because I'm actually using official terms. So, what are some of the problems in the book that Hylas is trying to bring up?
Distance.
Why does he think that's going to be relevant?
He's talking about the distance like stars and the moon.
Why?
Then he brings up dreams too.
Yeah, Philonous brings up dreams.
Yeah, Philonous brings up the dream.
Okay, well, let me talk about that a little bit. Now, what Hylas is trying to do, and it seems kind of crazy being the discussion of extension that we had earlier, which was a primary quality that was demonstrated to be in the mind. Distance seems to be implying that the object, there's an outerness to it. That it's somehow this implies that it's independent of the mind. This is one of Hylas's last ditch. It doesn't really make that much sense. He goes, well, the stars seem like they're out there, therefore they must exist independent of the mind. And he goes, well, you're seeing them, aren't you? Didn't we just concede that kind of stuff was in the mind, like if you're seeing something? He goes, when you dream, you see objects that seem like they're in a distance too. So you don't think that stars in your dreams are in the mind? And I said, well, of course not. Of course they're in the mind. Well, what's the big deal then? What's the difference? You already said that visual perceptions are in the mind. Just because it looks like it's far off doesn't mean that it's not in the mind. That doesn't mean anything. And likewise, when you go up closer to an object, does it change? Now, this is really important because this goes back to the Pittsburgh skyline point I brought up. When I go towards the Pittsburgh skyline, I can put that object in between my fingers. The object I see, the buildings. It appears small. The actual sensation is small. When I get up closer to the building, it is larger. That is, the perception is changing. And if extension was in the object, it wouldn't change. It'd be fixed. That means the shape of the object, if the perception, the experience of size was in the object, it would present itself to me as it was. It would not change from no matter what I was doing or perceiving myself to do. And so a lot of the issues in this question of distance were already covered. Hylas is basically begging the question or starting to retract things that he had already conceded earlier. And it's really just a really absurd objection. Now this one here, I'm using the actual official name of the problem, but what is brought up about a blind man? Anybody recall?
Something about he suddenly gains his sight back.
Yeah.
Did he lose his sight or was he born blind?
Born blind.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, was that before Julius Caesar or after? Oh no. Suppose a man was born blind, suddenly made to see. He could at first have no experience of what may be suggested by sight.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now this is actually a problem in philosophy. It was really popular at the time, the Molyneux problem. And what happened was John Locke wrote his great treatise, and this philosopher scientist named Molyneux presented a problem. He goes, okay, you imagine a man who's blind, and he could feel the difference between a globe and a cube by touch. That's, he couldn't see it. He could feel the shape. Okay, he knew the difference between the objects as far as shape. Now let's say his sight is regained, and he's not touching either one of the objects. Okay, is what he sees, like when he sees the cube in the visual, without touching them, can he tell which one matches up with his touch? Could he tell which one was the cube that he touched, which one was round, just by looking at it? That is the vision of a sphere going to line up with what he felt with his hands without touching it? He says, oh, the one that I see is round, that must be the one that I felt, and I concluded that it was round. Is there a likeness between the touch of something and the sight of it? This was the problem. Now, the reason this is relevant is because, and I think, to go back, what page was that on?
Bottom of 86.
Bottom of 86. I'm going to read some of the context here, briefly. So, and the question here is being like, books falling apart, is that, okay, do we have a suggestion from like one sense of touch to another? He's basically saying that can we conceive of these things apart from the mind? Can you conceive of the visual sensation of an object, okay, just from touching it? No. And that's sort of what the Molyneux problem was. Both Berkeley and Locke respond to this problem saying no. A person who touches a cube has that feeling of it. If he looks at the cube when he gains his sight without touching it, he's not going to be able to tell that that was the thing that he was touching and that he designated as a cube. Because the sensations are different. It might suggest to him, he might well, maybe if the way it looks is like the way I touch, and that sort of thing, it's something that you gain by experience, or it's by association. The reason is like, for instance, what he brought up with like a piece of metal that's hot. Okay, we know by experience that when you touch stuff that's glowing red, that it hurts your hand. So now when we look at a piece of iron that's glowing red, we don't even have to touch it, we know it's hot. We can look at it and say, okay, well that's probably hot. It's glowing red. If you look underneath your car and your catalytic converter's clogged up and it's cherry red, you don't want to touch it. You don't have to, touch it in order to know it's hot. You can see it now. And the reason, but why would you know that? By association. You associate the touch of things that are glowing red with ouch. So now there's a suggestion. That's why he brings up the example of the sound. You can see a carriage and you can think of the clopping noise. Or you hear the clopping noise of the horse walking and you think of the carriage. It's suggestion by experience. You've experienced them as a whole, so when you see a part, it's like out there. I can hear cars. I hear the sound, I imagine the vehicle in my mind, the image. Now, if I've never saw a car my entire life visually, all I ever did was hear that noise, just hearing that noise wouldn't give me an image of a car. It's by association. And so the whole idea that, we can imagine these mind-independent qualities is pointed out by Philonous is ridiculous, because we know of other sensations that we're not directly perceiving by association. They're always interrelated in our mind. And this was an important issue at the time that was hotly debated. And both Berkeley and Locke gave a negative answer to the question. So that's one issue. Now the third one is really important. It's called the burden of proof. You see that what Hylas says to Philonous is, well, I'm just going to keep holding to my position unless you can prove that all that exists is stuff that's in the mind. You have to prove to me that matter doesn't exist. And Philonous says, what? Has it come to that? Well, let's go there then. You want to go there, we'll go there. Because there's a principle in debate and a principle in reason that says the person with the affirmative position has the burden of proof. Philonous doesn't have to prove anything. He's holding a negative position. You can't prove a negative. Now, a negative is saying that all there is this. Now, Hylas' position is the one with the burden of proof. It's actually trying to say that there is something other than what's immediately perceived. He's proving something. Same thing with arguments between atheists and theists. The atheist holds a negative position. You can't prove atheism. And most atheists would be willing to admit that. You can't prove it. You can't prove that no God exists. You'd have to be God to prove it, because you'd have to be omniscient and know all variables. And most atheists are willing to admit that. That's why they challenge theists and say, well, no, you're the one who has to prove your position. It's the affirmative position. You're affirming the existence of something. And that idealism that Berkeley here isn't trying to prove the existence of something. It's denying the existence of something. Berkeley's denying the existence of mind-independent objects. He doesn't have a position to prove. The burden of proof is on Hylas. Hylas has to prove that there is matter, as philosophically defined. You have to prove, Hylas, that matter exists. And after conceding already that all sensations and my only way of knowing of matter, all those things, all my processes of knowing exist in the mind, it's a pretty bad burden of proof to have to bear. You don't want to have that burden if you're Hylas. And Hylas was trying to say, well, you have to prove to me that matter doesn't exist. And Philonous is like, well, really? You want to talk? You want to go there? Actually, you're the one who has to make the proof. You're holding the affirmative position. The default position is the negative, and that's actually the idea that, no, only the content of your own mind exists. And it's a really important point to make, that all this dialogue that's been going on isn't Berkeley trying to prove his system per se. He's defending it as a default assumption. He's saying, no, this is a negative position. I'm denying something that people are claiming exists. They're the ones that have to prove it. And there's a ton of reasons why you can't bear that burden. You can't prove the existence of mind-independent stuff that has no taste, color, smell, extension. It's meaningless. It's a meaningless phrase. The idea that's like the word substratum or substance that underlies all objects that we discussed before. It doesn't make any sense. It has no meaning. And so that was a really important thing that was brought up by Philonous. Now, there's another thing that we talked about. It holds 2 or 3 different points in the discussion together, and it can be summed up in this phrase: representational realism. Can anybody guess what arguments?
Was it the Julius Caesar?
Yes,
the picture. Mm-hmm. You saying that if you look at a picture, it was the representation of the real person, so it wasn't the real thing or something. And then he said, if another person who's never seen Julius Caesar looks at it, won't he be seeing the same thing as you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And there was another aspect to this argument. Now, there's a couple ways he refuted it. Not just that with that example, but also with, if I have a because basically what Hylas is saying is, okay, I agree that the whole object's in my mind, but that's just a representation of something that's really out there. So what I have in mind is an exact copy, just like a picture. Let's say I took a picture of one of you. The photo is a representation of who you are, only it's much more detailed. The representation of my mind is actually the touch, the smell. If I were to hug you, that's actually a representation of the real you outside of what I'm experiencing. That's basically what Hylas has come to. He's saying, and it's actually very similar to the starting point for Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant would say that we have sensations come in, my mind forms the object. We don't really know what those sensations are out there independent of my mind. All we know is the content of my own mind. My mind is the one that actually creates the people, creates everything. That's why he denied the existence of God, because you're trying to prove something outside of what my mind actually creates. And he goes, and the fact that we've created a concept of God is just because our minds feel the necessity to have that. It wasn't because you can't really prove something that's independent of my thinking. And it's because all of reality was constructed by myself. Now, Kant was a representational realist, but that's sort of like where he's actually going to, this criticism is actually going to drive Hylas. And Kant is very close to skepticism. In fact, he was very influenced by Hume. Representational realism is saying, okay, I have a representation of a person. This is in my mind. This is all I know. And I'm just claiming that there's another person out here. My knowledge of this person is only in this. This is all I have is a photograph. All I have is what I'm seeing. And that's in the mind. But there must be something independent of my mind. There must be a person this is representing. This is Hylas' argument. But what Philonous does is he draws a division between this. He draws a strict division between the representation and what's being claimed to exist independent of the representation. And the reason this is so important is because it really flies in the face of the common sense that Hylas is trying to cling to so desperately. So, to give an example, in the discussion about the representation, he says, okay, the representation, it moves, right? Like if I were, once again, like with an object, like with the building on the Pittsburgh skyline, it's small. When I get closer and closer, the object appears bigger and bigger and bigger. Pretty soon, right by the building, it's huge. But 5 minutes prior to that, I can fit it between my fingers when I flick my hand up. So the object in my mind fluctuates. It gets bigger or smaller as I move closer or further away. Similarly, depending on lighting in a room, an object's color might seem different. You might have a cup that looks green under a certain light. If this light was dimmed in here, it would look kind of bluish. So there's change in our experience. So all that's in the mind. This is all the representation. Okay, Hylas says, okay, I agree. The representation changes. But this doesn't. The real thing doesn't change. Okay, so this is the real kicker, as he goes, so the real building doesn't change when you get closer or further away. It doesn't get bigger or smaller. It stays the one size. But the image in your head fluctuates. How are they similar? How is the one representing the other? In my mind, what I know of the building changes. It's always changing. But you're saying it's a direct representation of something that doesn't change at all. How's that a representation? How does that make any sense? And the second issue is, you're saying that what's in the mind, representations have colors, they have odors, all those things are in the mind. What it's representing has none of those. How can a color be a direct representation of a non-color? So you're saying the red I have in my representation is representing invisibility? You're saying extension or shape is representing directly something that doesn't have shape? How does that make sense? That's basically what he's presenting. He's saying that your representation doesn't mean anything. You're saying that you're representing something that can't be represented. Mm-hmm. That's the criticism. It draws a whole divide. Now this is where you get Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant says, okay, well we can't know what's out there. All we know is our representation. We get it, we have sensations come in, our mind forms representation. It's not really a representation, it's just, that's what it is. Forget this, it's unknowable. All we got is what's in our head. But there is something out there. Berkeley's going to say there isn't something out here. Kant says, no, there's something out there, we just can't know it. And Berkeley would say, well, why even assert it at all? Why even assert it at all? We'll say that, and he'll present this later, God is presenting reality to the minds of his creatures. Directly, what you can call that is revelation. That is the phrase to describe this process. Reality being revealed from one supreme mind to the minds of his creatures. And so, in fact, but he doesn't get into this dialogue. In fact, in being pressed on this issue, you see Philonous actually say, he goes, well, talking about rationally inferring causes from things that are observed, that's not the point of this inquiry. He even says that in this section of the dialogue. And that's because that's going to be for later on. In the later dialogues, he's going to say, well, what do our perceptions tell us? Do they point us to their source? Where do they come from? Do they need to come from anywhere? That's going to be the questions that are going to be delved into in the next studies. And so for now, this is basically the last stand of Hylas, and he gives up. He concedes it all after he's been refuted. He says, "Well, I'm just going to say that okay, I can't bear the burden of proof. I can't maintain this representational realism. In the end, I'm a skeptic." And then church bell rings. So we have to really think about and chew on these basic concepts that are laid down in the first dialogue, because they're going to really serve as the basis for the next. We're going to deal with a Hylas that is more skeptical, more cynical in the next couple studies. It's going to be really, really interesting. So any questions? No?
I guess I want to clarify that one illustration where you were talking about the building and how he was saying that, let's see if I can say this correctly, that at different places where you're seeing the building, it appears small or large, but it's representing a fixed object.
Yes.
I guess as you were saying it, I was trying to figure out what was wrong with what he was saying, because we think about it, there is an objective reality, An object is an object, okay? And we understand it's there. But what was wrong with what he was saying there in terms of we're just perceiving the object differently based on where we are located?
Okay, well, the problem is that when he says fixed, he's saying that, okay, the perception changes, okay? So, but we got to remember that this discussion is built on an earlier discussion on extension.
Right.
Okay, is extension in the object? That was the idea in this what was being assumed to be a mind-independent object. Is extension the object? Well, and that's the point. Remember, this is about experience. I'm experiencing, I'm subject, like the pain. Is pain in fire or is pain in my mind? Okay, well, you can't distinguish pain from extreme heat. So, if you have extreme heat, and it's indistinguishable from pain, then extreme heat is also in the mind. So, when it comes to fire, is extreme heat in fire or is extreme heat in the mind? That was one example, okay, of experience. It exists in a conscious perceiver. Now, when applied to extension, it's very similar. Extension is something that we experience. So when we experience the extendedness of an object, let's say the size of of like a building, okay, in the Pittsburgh skyline, if the object has a fixed, and you can't even draw it because this is all, like I said, philosophical theory.
Right.
If extension is in the object, that is, it's in it, not in my experience, mind you, but in it, and it's presenting itself as it is to me, and it doesn't change, then when I get that extension, it won't vary. If the object's revealing itself to me, if the object revealing as it is to my mind.
Right. Well, the object, I understand the object is not revealing itself.
Yes.
To you.
Yes, that's representational realism.
Right. But I guess I was struggling in terms of understanding what he was saying in terms of that illustration there.
You're right. Well, with representational, it kind of reduces back to the same problem. Because what he's saying is that the image I have is in flux, okay? What I have of the building is changes, okay? I have, small, large, big as I get closer. That's the image I have, okay? The images I have change.
Right.
Okay. Now, but they're representing something that doesn't change.
Right.
Okay? So what he's saying is if the representation I have is a direct correlation to something that doesn't change, well, how can that be called a representation? And the similar would be like, if I'm saying that the object itself has a property, let's say, and he wouldn't even use the word color because Hylas even admitted that color's in the mind. He's saying that, okay, when we look at an object, sometimes it's green in different lights, sometimes it's blue, sometimes it's red. Those colors are representing non-color.
Yeah, that makes no sense.
Okay, well, but they're related. All right, he's saying that there's a fixed property in the object, fixed. That is the the shape of the object is fixed, but when I have these fluctuating images, I'm saying that because once again, extension is related to color. It's related to that visual experience. So if there's a fluctuation in my visual experience, and the object's fixed, there's a disconnect between that relationship. Now let me give you an example. Let's go back to extension a little bit more. In extension, when you perceive an object, let's say a lot of times we think in terms of measurement. That's why this is hard to swallow. Well, the building is 80 feet tall.
Right.
Okay, even if it looks small from a distance, right? I mean, that's one of the examples. Okay. Now, what is designations of measurement, like feet? How do we determine those measurements? Are they basic, or do we develop those measurements off of observation? Where do they come from?
Well, we created a standard.
Correct. Exactly. Now, would that standard make as much sense experientially to, let's say, a mite? Now, for instance, because really, our designation of what 80 feet is like, experientially, is based on our experience. Now, if I imagine, let's say, I know from my experience at 30 feet, if I jump off a 30-foot building, I'm probably going to break my leg. Okay? But now, we can use that measurement, but that's a measurement that we developed on our experience. Now, if I'm a mite, and I jump off a 30-foot building, okay, that designation does not have the same meaning for me as it does for a human. Okay? That might mean I get swept off into the wind, off into oblivion, get swallowed by a crow flying by. It's a completely different experience of that designation. Designations are arbitrary. It's the same thing with temperature. All right, the only reason temperatures make any sense at all is because we've made them to correlate to our experiences. We know that at a certain point in our observation, when it feels really cold, water turns hard. Okay, so we create a number, 0 degrees Celsius. We designate the number because this is something we typically see,
right.
So we throw a number on it. Okay, that's our designation. But now for, let's say, a creature from Pluto, okay, that's like summer. That designation that we use for coldness, he's saying that's hot. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you understand? The numbers correlate to our experience, they're arbitrary. So what the issue is, we can't think just in terms of measurement, we're thinking in terms of experience. Experience precedes the invention of a measurement. And the measurement is relative to our experience. Like I said, a foot for me, experientially, is not the same thing to a mite. To a mite, let's say if I was the size of a mite, a foot would be 30 feet. It's from that relative experience. And so we got to understand that what is being discussed here, he's saying that the object is fixed. That is, if it's fixed, how it will appear to the mite and to the man would be the same because it's presenting itself to the mind. Now, if it's fixed, now that's presentational realism. In representational realism, it says, okay, I admit there's fluctuations, it's in the mind, but it is directly representing the way it is independent of my mind. But that's not the case, because you're saying it's fixed, but the way that it's represented is not fixed.
Right.
That's the issue. Hopefully that makes it a little bit more clear.
It does. I don't know that I completely grasp it, but
well, I mean,
I'm getting
the number, the measurements is what really gets in the way.
Yeah, measurements hurt our mind because what we want to make a standard that's developed from experience, and then we want to make it more basic than the experience that helped us to develop it. We're putting the cart before the horse. And when we think in those terms, it makes us forget the more basic things. And that's what Berkeley's going at. He's going to the most basic principles. So when he says that the object is fixed, he's saying that it's fixed regardless of any kind of experience that we have of it. So, and remember, measurement is determined by experience. So he's saying it's so fixed that the idea of it getting bigger and smaller is completely in the mind. He's basically telling us to conceive of something that's inconceivable. We can't conceive of an object fixed in that sort of way. It's beyond anything we've ever experienced.
Right.
And that's sort of what Hylas is getting at. He's saying that the real object, just like colors are all in the mind, and they're representing something that has no color. It's the same type of absurdity all across the board, no matter what type of sensation you have.
Right.
So my feeling of heat or coldness is representing something that's neither hot or cold. Well, how can it be representation? How can it be correspond at all to what you're saying? Color doesn't correspond to non-color.
Right.
That's the issue. And extension, same way. Fluctuation and extension that we see is actually, to be honest, he's saying that extension corresponds to non-extension. Is really what he's saying, and that doesn't make any sense. And I think that's really what we got to really see at this. It's really a knockout blow to the system.
Yeah.
So, any more questions? That was a really good question, by the way. It helped me to help get into some things that need clarified. Anything else? Okay. Well, thank you for coming. This was a really enjoyable study. We finished the first dialogue. It's concluded. So, have a good evening and see you next time.